In this video, I'm going to discuss briefly Descartes and Spinoza on the existence of God. So in the work of both Spinoza and Descartes, the theology plays a very, very important role. Now, their approach to theology was a rationalist one. Descartes and Spinoza both believed that the existence of God was something that was rational, and that one didn't necessarily need to have any religious teachers to be able to prove the existence of God and to know what God was. They thought that philosophy was fully equipped to use a purely rational approach to demonstrate both God's existence and the nature of God. Now, in Descartes' philosophy, the existence of God is very important because for him, God's existence ensures that what one knows is not a deception. Because as we saw in an earlier video, Descartes basically argues that the only thing I can know with absolute certainty is that I'm thinking, and that even if everything around me were deception, I would still be the one thinking that I'm deceived. And therefore he thought that I can clearly and distinctly perceive that I'm thinking, and therefore I can deduce that I exist. But then he draws this somewhat strange problem, and what he says is, but what if there exists this evil being, this evil demon, that's even making it seem that the fact that I'm thinking is something true? What if there's an evil deceiver that's making it seem that I'm thinking, and that actually I don't even exist, I'm just a creation of this evil demon, and that really me thinking is just a illusion created by some evil deceiver. In modern versions of this argument, we're brains in a vat created by an evil scientist. It's the same thing. Well, Descartes has a response to this. And what he argues is that in order for this not to be the case, in order for it to be the case that my thinking is both certain and a proof of my existence, in order for this to be the case, I have to assume the existence of God, according to Descartes. Because what he argues is that he believes that God is loving, and that a loving God would not create the possibility of such kinds of deception in human beings. That although I have a body and I've been given the potential to make mistakes using my body, my soul, according to Descartes, was created by God, and this God would not make it so that I would be deceived. And therefore, that God ensures that there's no evil deceiver. That actually the evil deceiver could be deceiving me about what I'm perceiving with my body, but that God's existence ensures that what I know with my soul is not simply an illusion. So this created a problem for Descartes. How do I know that God exists? This has always been a philosophical debate. Outside of religion, how do I know that God exists? Well, Descartes has an argument that's very simple and goes back to the medieval philosopher by the name of Saint Anselm. And this is known as the ontological argument. This argument is very, very simple. Basically, what he says is, in the definition of God is defined as a supremely perfect being, an absolutely perfect being, right? Now, this is how Descartes defines God. He says God is a supremely perfect being. Not a single imperfection belongs to the nature of God. Now, he says, so that's the first part of his argument, to not be able to exist, non-existence, would be an imperfection, right? So for something to not be able to exist, for something to be contingent upon the causes that brought it into being, and also for something to be finite, capable of not existing, Descartes says, well, this is an imperfection. But God is absolutely perfect, and therefore Descartes says we can't say that the possibility of God not existing is even possible, because to even say such a thing, to doubt the existence of God, would negate the very definition of God as a supremely perfect being. Hence it follows that necessary existence belongs to perfection, and thus, because perfection belongs to God, and you get the conclusion, God exists. So what he basically does is he deduces God's existence from the very definition that he made about God, and assumes that if you accept that definition, then by virtue of that you will accept the existence of God. He doesn't need to get into these other types of arguments, like the one from Aristotle, the unmoved mover argument, which basically says that everything has a cause that exists, but what caused everything that came into being? He says there must be something that moves everything but is itself an unmoved mover. It's something that causes everything but is itself not caused. I could say a cause of itself, a causa sui. And that causa sui is God. That was the traditional understanding. Descartes doesn't do this. Descartes says that God's existence follows from his definition, right? And now, there's a further part of this to Descartes' understanding. Descartes thought that knowledge of anything is always clear and distinct, a clear and distinct concept, which is a concept that is indubitable, a concept that I cannot doubt the truth of. He gives a set of very simple, basic ones, like 2 + 2 is 4, is an indubitable concept. When I perceive the truth, 2 + 2 is 4, I can't call it into question. If I call it into question, I'm engaging in an absurdity. And Descartes thought that this was true about God, that if you say that God is an absolutely supreme being who's perfect, then non-existence would be excluded from that definition, and hence existence would be clearly and distinctly perceived to belong to God's existence. And so, from that basis, Descartes then says, well, that must mean that God exists. That is basically what Descartes thought. And that for Descartes was very important because the existence of God ensures that what I'm believing to be certain, the fact that I exist, isn't just an illusion created by an evil deceiver, right? Now, as you can see, this is very much in Descartes' Christian understanding, where on the one hand, God is everything that's good, and the Satan is everything that's evil, and you get this kind of good and evil kind of binary worldview. Deception is everything that's evil, everything that's true and perfect is on God's side. Well, what's interesting about this is Spinoza, who came along a little bit after Descartes died, a few maybe 30 years or so after, radically changed the way that people thought about God, but thinking within the philosophical categories created by Descartes. So Spinoza was a 17th century Jewish philosopher who lived in the Netherlands. He was born in Amsterdam, but he had kind of what were considered heretical views, and as a result of this was expelled from his community. So he had to come in front of the rabbinical council, although I don't believe he was present at this, and they read out a ban, and he was banned from his community, and that was because he had what were viewed by the time to be heretical views that were in conflict with the theological principles of the Sephardic Jewish community that Spinoza was a part of. And so after he was banned from his community, he could no longer have contact with his friends and his family, and he had to leave Amsterdam. And he went and lived. He lived in a while in a city in the Netherlands called Rijnsburg, where he started working on a text called the Ethics. But the Ethics, it's not about ethics necessarily. It's his complete philosophical work. Then he went and lived in the Dutch town of Leiden, which had a big university, and a bunch of people who were interested in Descartes and studying the work of Descartes. And it was there that Spinoza published a book called The Principles of Cartesian Philosophy, where he sought to explain the basic ideas of Descartes' ideas in a simple, accessible form, while also critiquing some of his basic notions. Finally, towards the end of his life, Spinoza settled in Den Haag, or also called The Hague, and there he died in his early 40s, and he never published the Ethics. It was published posthumously by his friends, but it was a very, very controversial book. It was denounced and condemned by both the Dutch authorities and the religious authorities as being a heretical book, as being atheistic, as entailing the non-existence of God. But what's interesting about Spinoza is he takes all these ideas from Descartes, mind-body dualism, as well as what's related to it, substance dualism, and he actually shows that he draws their implications. And their implications were quite unsettling, and in the time after Spinoza wrote, this resulted in a kind of reactionary backlash against Cartesian thinking. And a lot of the followers of Descartes were persecuted, and Spinoza himself was wanted by the Dutch authorities, who were, at the time, there was no separation of church and state, and the church wanted him dead because of his radical viewpoints. So let's look at Spinoza briefly. And Spinoza is very, very difficult to read. So this is going to be maybe a little watered down, I guess. Hopefully not too much. So, to begin with, Spinoza wrote in a kind of, how should I put it, geometrical style. He wanted to make things like God's existence, for example, analyzable through geometrical principles so that you could achieve the same level of scientific certainty about religious notions, such as God, and also ethics, such as right and wrong, and other philosophical ideas, using the same level of scientific rigor as geometry. Okay, so what I want to look at is his philosophical theory of God, which is very, very interesting. So in the first book of the Ethics, Spinoza lays out a series of definitions. And his idea was that what a definition is supposed to do is to provide you with a clear formulation that expresses the very essence of a thing and the process by which a thing came into being. So, for example, in another work, Spinoza says that, how would I define a circle if I want to provide a clear and distinct definition of a circle? Well, he would say you don't define it by its properties. You don't define it by, for example, its circumference or its curvature or any of that. What you rather say is a circle is a geometrical object that's drawn with a compass that you put down and you turn in a 360-degree motion. That's a circle. And the idea is that if you had that definition, you could draw a circle yourself and deduce all of its properties by using your abstract intellectual abilities. The idea is that that definition of the circle expresses the very process by which a circle comes into being. And so in the Ethics, Spinoza provides a series of definitions, and the idea is that each of the definitions is designed to provide you with a clear formulation of the thing. Okay, I don't have the definitions right here in front of me, but most of them are in memory. So the most important one the first one, is the definition of substance. So Spinoza defines substance. He says, substance is that which is in itself and is conceived through itself, or that the concept of which does not involve another thing to be formed. That which is in itself and conceived through itself, it doesn't depend on the concept of something else. So the idea here is substance. By the way, it doesn't mean like a substance, like a chemical compound or something, or like some people might use the term substance use. It's not what he's talking about. Substance is a metaphysical object, and it defines a kind of. It's essentially something that persists through a multiplicity of changes. So if you, for example, if you have the example Descartes gives is the example of honeycomb, right? Take a honeycomb, you put it in the fire, not honeycomb, wax. You take the wax, you put it in the fire, the wax burns. Its substance is simply the fact that it's an extended thing. Its substance is not something that you immediately perceive, but its substance is what persists through a multiplicity of changes. It's a kind of most basic property that it's different than a thing's essence, but it's essentially what persists through a multiplicity of changes. And so Descartes says that with wax, substance is essentially the fact that it's extended. By extension means like extended in space. It's a body that occupies a place in space. And no matter how much you change it, it'll still be a body. It'll still be matter, in other words. That's the idea. So Spinoza, he defines substance, he gives it a definition, as that which is in itself and conceived through itself. So substance, number one, doesn't depend on anything to exist. Substance exists through its own nature. The concept of substance only involves the concepts of substance. You don't need the concept of any other thing to think about substance. Substance is independent of anything else. And so what Spinoza will say is substance is a cause of itself. Because he says that when you have two things that exist, if you have something that exists that's caused by something. So, for example, we might say a cough is caused by a disease. The cough doesn't exist on its own. It depends on the disease, the virus that's causing the disease. The concept of the cough depends on the concept of the disease, right? What Spinoza says is that substance differs in that it doesn't act this way. The concept of substance involves the concept of substance. It doesn't involve the concept of anything else. You don't need the concept of something else. And because of that, it's a cause of itself. Because if it were caused by something else, then that other thing would be involved in the concept of substance. Right? So you can see he deduces this. From the concept of substance, you can deduce that substance is a cause of itself. And basically what Spinoza will say is that he defines God then. He says God is substance, and he says that it consists of infinite attributes, each which express eternal and infinite essence. So God is substance, right? Now that kind of makes sense because we've defined substance as that which exists in itself, doesn't need the concept of anything else. That kind of corresponds to the traditional understandings of God as existing independently, especially in the creationist world outlook where God is the creator, he doesn't depend on anything, he exists independently. Spinoza very much captures this in the concept of substance. He says God is substance consisting of infinite attributes. Now we need to understand this, we have to know what he means by an attribute. So he says an attribute is what the mind perceives of substance as constituting its essence. Now in the Ethics he kind of never really explains what he means by that, so there's been a lot of scholars who have tried to understand by it. An attribute is part of substance. An attribute is essentially what we perceive as belonging to substance. Now, it seems to be in Spinoza's writing, there are only two attributes that we are able to perceive with the mind. There's infinite attributes, an infinite amount of them, but there's only two of them that human beings have access to. And those two attributes are thought and extension. The thinking thing and the extended thing. And Spinoza will say in Book 2 of the Ethics that substance is a thinking thing and that it's an extended thing because thought and extension are its two attributes. So when Spinoza says that God is substance consisting of infinite attributes, what he means is that God has all the attributes. Every attribute that exists belongs to God's divine essence. Right? So some people in the 17th century thought that was heretical by at least their religious standards, because if you say that God has all the attributes, and God is substance, that which exists in itself and conceived through itself, then what you would effectively, in effect, be saying is that God is an extended thing. And some people perceived Spinoza as saying that this means that God has a body. God has a body. Well, the traditional religious traditions taught that God was something independent of any body, that God rather creates all the bodies, but that God doesn't have a body. God is something independent of all those bodies. God is something totally immaterial. And that by saying that God has the attribute of extension, Spinoza was apparently saying that God is an extended thing, and hence God is a physical body. And it's interesting, what Spinoza will say is, it makes sense to say, at least in the traditional religious traditions, that God has the attribute of thinking, because that would see, the religious traditions have said God is all-knowing, and so that would mean that God has the attribute of thinking. That was uncontroversial, but to say that God is an extended thing, this was something that many people perceived to be atheistic, and that what Spinoza was trying to do was to break down the very terms of theology, but from within. So we'll look a little bit in a moment how he develops that. Okay, so just to summarize. Number one, substance is that which is in itself and conceived through itself. It's a kind of radical independence. It's a thing that is independent of everything. It doesn't depend on anything. It doesn't need anything to exist. It exists by its very necessity, but it doesn't need anything to exist. Because if it needed something to exist, it would be caused by something, and that would already mean that the concept of substance involves the concept of another thing, and Spinoza says that's impossible. He then says that an attribute is what the mind perceives as constituting the essence of substance, such as thought or extension. And he then says God is infinite substance, consisting of infinite attributes, each which express eternal and divine essence. So that last thing, that God is the infinite substance, means that God has all the attributes. Every attribute that exists is part of God's divine essence. But there are only two attributes that human beings have access to, and that's thought and extension. Now, I would like to examine here whether or not this question of whether Spinoza is actually saying that God has a body. Because this is what people have accused him of, and I've written a paper where I showed that this was not the case. So there's another concept that Spinoza introduces, and that is the concept of a mode. And a mode is everything that follows from the attributes of substance. So a mode is essentially an effect of substance. A mode is everything that requires the concept of something else in order to be understood, right? So for example, to understand the concept of a mind, I need the concept of thought. The concept of thought for Spinoza is independent. You just need the concept of thought, and that is that gives you the concept of thought. It doesn't depend on anything else. A mind, on the other hand, my mind, my intellectual capacities, requires the concept of thought. The same thing with a body, a physical body. Whether it's a piece of wax, whether it's a tree, whether it's a natural body like a river or a landscape, or even a human being, my physical body. That body, according to Spinoza, requires the concept of the attribute of extension. And so modes are all the things that follow from substance, but are not identical to substance, are not, they depend on substance, they follow from it, but they're different from it. Now, so when Spinoza says that God is an extended thing, or he has the attribute of extension, he's actually not saying that God has a body. Rather, what he's saying is God is the principle that makes bodies themselves possible. When I have a thought, God is actually Spinoza is saying that God doesn't have a mind. God is rather has the attribute of thinking that makes all minds themselves possible. So what Spinoza is in effect saying is that he's not saying that God is a physical body or that God has a mind, but God rather contains the principles, the attributes that make these things possible. So in many ways, and as we'll see in a moment, this is similar to the religious traditions that have taught that God is the creator, because physical bodies, as well as spiritual minds, the soul, maybe you could say, are reflections of God's divine essence, but are not identical to God. God rather makes these things possible, and bodies and minds depend on God, but are themselves different from it. So in this way, Spinoza thinks about God as something immaterial. God is withdraws and he's abstracted from every particular thing that exists, and in the very process of that abstraction makes all those things possible. That's how Spinoza thinks about it. Now, what Spinoza will argue in his Ethics, and I don't want to look at all the specific arguments because it's very, very complicated, but I can summarize his argument fairly simply here. What Spinoza says is there is only one substance, there is not multiple substances. Because the philosophical tradition before Spinoza, in the writing of people like Descartes, as well as others such as Leibniz, claimed that there were multiple substances. So, for example, Descartes thought that each substance has a unique attribute and set of modes that go with it. And the world is composed of at least two substances, but maybe more. Thinking substance, which involves all the minds and the properties that define the minds, and extended substances, which involve all the bodies and the physical properties that they contain. But there are two substances, not one. Spinoza is going to reject that idea. There's another philosopher by the name of Leibniz, who was writing at the time of Spinoza and engaged in a letter exchange with him, who claimed that there were an infinite number of substances, not one, not two, but an infinite number of them. And he called these monads. Monads were these little essentially like atomic particles that are everywhere and compose the world, and they're all part of God, according to Leibniz. But Spinoza rejects this. What Spinoza will argue is that there is one substance, and everything that exists is a mode of an attribute that one substance has. And that one substance is God. And everything that exists in the world is dependent on that single substance that he calls God. So let's look at how he argues this. It's a very simple argument based on what he said so far. So we know that substance is that which is in itself and conceived through itself. And what Spinoza will argue is, imagine for a moment that there are two substances, substance A and substance B. And substance B contains the attribute of extension, right? And God also, substance A, contains that attribute of extension. The result of this is actually that there will now be two substances that both contain the attribute of extension. Substance B will contain an attribute that God has. And therefore, the substance B that contains you could say the extended substance, will now require the concept of a different substance, God, But that already contradicts the definition of substance that Spinoza's given. Because what that then means is that the substance is divided. And one of Spinoza's major arguments is that substance is indivisible. Because if you were to divide substance into different parts, then each of those parts would involve the concept of a different part of the whole that they're part of, right? So suppose you divided substance into three parts, A, B, and C. Then part B would require the concept of part A, and part C would require the concept of part B. But Spinoza says substance is that which is in itself and conceived through itself, that which does not need the concept of another thing to be formed. And his idea is that if you therefore assume that substance is divided, it no longer corresponds to your definition. And so that's his mode of arguing, is to say that, well, anytime you assume there's a substance existing outside of God, that would result in a contradiction where multiple substances exist, and therefore substance will require the concept of a different substance, and that or something other than that substance. And so Spinoza's conclusion that he's going to draw from this is that God is the only substance that exists. There are no substances outside of God. God is the only substance. Everything that exists is in the substance of God. Nothing exists outside of it. Right? Now, some people have claimed that what this means is that Spinoza is a pantheist, and that Spinoza would look out in the world and see God everywhere. Pantheism means everything is God. That you see the river, that's God. You see the trees, that's God. You see a human, that's a God. No, that's actually not what Spinoza's saying. The reason why he's not saying that is because everything in the world that exists, trees, human beings, rivers, minds, regardless of that, all of these things are modes that follow from the divine nature of God, but are themselves not identical to God. God is absolutely different from every one of these things, because whereas all the bodies and minds depend on God, God doesn't depend on any of these things. God only depends on himself, and therefore Spinoza can still see an important distinction between physical and spiritual created things and God as the creator. So in many ways, what Spinoza has done is he's taken the traditional religious ways of thinking about God as the creator, but he's given it a kind of philosophical meaning. But there is nonetheless an important difference, especially from these religious traditions. In Spinoza's understanding, God is no longer this transcendent being. God is rather immanent. Everything that exists is not God, but at the same time, everything that exists is in God, is in it. And that's what he means by this term, in it. Everything that exists, it depends on God. That's his idea. And Spinoza therefore thought that God doesn't exist outside of the world. God is in the world, while at the same time being totally other, totally different from everything that exists. Nothing is God, and yet everything is dependent on it. God is in everything, according to Spinoza, is everywhere, because everything depends on the substance of God. But at the same time, God withdraws from everything that exists. That's the idea that Spinoza had. And so, in this way, Spinoza argued very much against the traditional idea that God is a this personal being that you can have a relationship with. This probably is something that got him in trouble with both the Jewish authorities from when he grew up and from where he was expelled, as well as the Christian authorities in the Netherlands in the 17th century. Because Spinoza didn't deny the existence of God. I mean, in many ways, Spinoza was a deeply religious and spiritual person. Some people said he was God intoxicated, that literally everything for Spinoza was God, and he was deeply close to God in a way that many human beings maybe found it hard to. But what made him kind of controversial was for him, God was nonetheless something impersonal. In the Ethics, for example, he denies the idea that God loves human beings. God simply, the creation simply follows from God's divine essence, according to Spinoza. But God doesn't love human beings. He doesn't love his creation. The primary reason for this, Spinoza will show why. Love, for Spinoza, is something that is a human, emotional state. The way he defines love is the process of going from a lower perfection to a greater perfection, and the pleasure that produces. That's love for Spinoza. Love is the perception that something helped me to go to a greater state of perfection. But God, for Spinoza, is absolutely perfect. And therefore, God doesn't need to go to a greater state of perfection. And hence to say that God loves, for Spinoza, is not meaningful. However, Spinoza thought that by orienting your mind towards God, by thinking about God philosophically, you can go to a greater state of perfection. You go from simply believing things, and he had a whole theory of knowledge as well, which centered around trying to get to the truth. And so Spinoza thought it's a duty of human beings to love God, because that allows us to become more perfect and go to a greater state of perfection. And this is accompanied by a great state of pleasure. And Spinoza did not believe that the worship of God had to be something you do in a church or a synagogue or a mosque. For Spinoza, every activity you do can become a way of participating in God's creation, because anything that makes you more perfect essentially makes you more like God. And in the process of doing this, you therefore become more perfect. And Spinoza, he has this passage, I don't have it in front of me here, but it's something along the lines of, you should do everything in moderation. Enjoy great works of art, enjoy the theater, go on walks. Everything you do can be a way of relating and becoming closer to God, because these things make you more perfect. And whatever makes us more perfect makes us closer to the divine attributes that God has. And so that's Spinoza's idea. But he thought that God doesn't love human beings simply because he thought this was a human term. And he was very, very against attributing human notions, everything from God loves human beings, to God answers people's prayers. He disagreed with this because he thought these were human ideas. He thought God was, in this sense, on some levels, impersonal, but Spinoza still thought you could develop a personal relationship to his God, to God as the substance, by trying to understand him and trying to form a clear and distinct ideas of his attributes. So that is what Spinoza's philosophy thus entails, is that God is immanent, and many scholars have written about this, is immanent in that God resides in everything essentially, but that God at the same time is different from all those things. It's not pantheism though, it's still monotheism, and it's still very much in the traditional way of understanding God. Now, one last thing that's extremely radical in Spinoza's philosophy and extremely helpful. It's wonderful that he developed this. So in the previous videos, I provided a critique, or I showed how some writers have critiqued mind-body dualism, the separation of the mind and the body. Spinoza was very critical of mind-body dualism. And what he shows is that, as I've said, for him, God is substance. Substance has infinite attributes, two of which we know, thought and extension. Mind is a mode of the attribute thought. Bodies are modes of the attribute extension, but they are simply two modes of attributes which are part of the same substance. There's not two substances, there's this one substance, and hence mind and body are part of the same single entity. Minds and bodies follow from the same single substance. And therefore Spinoza says they can't be divided. What he develops is an alternative to mind-body dualism, which is known as parallelism. And what parallelism says, to quote Spinoza, the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. What happens in the mind has an effect on what goes on in the body, while at the same time being different from it. And what goes on in the body, vice versa, has an effect on what goes on in the mind, while at the same time being different from it. So in many ways, Spinoza was a forerunner of modern psychology and psychiatry. He was very much under the belief that you had to look after your body, because if you don't look after your body, it will affect your mind, because your mind and your body are part of the same single entity. They're not separate. But the body can be studied independently of the mind, and the mind can be studied independently of the body. But what happens in one affects the other. And that's something many psychologists would say. If you're very, very depressed, then there's a good chance you could develop physical symptoms. And on the other hand, if you don't sleep well, or you don't look after your body, or you live a very unhealthy lifestyle, it could definitely affect your mind. But at the same time, these things are kind of different for Spinoza. And so what Spinoza does in his ethics is he tries to define all the different types of emotions that the mind could produce in order to kind of study them. So in this way, this is parallelism. It's an alternative to mind-body dualism, and it's unique in that it reunites the mind and the body, which philosophers like Descartes sought to divide, but using many of their own kind of concepts. Okay, so that is Spinoza's ideas. To summarize them, there's one substance, that substance is God, and everything that exists comes from that one substance, while at the same time, everything that exists is a mode of an attribute that God has. Number two, mind and body are not separated. They're rather parallel. What happens in one affects what happens in the other, but mind and body are part of the same substance. So those are I would say, the two major aspects of Spinoza's theology and his philosophy. And in many ways, they kind of foresaw many of the developments in science. In many ways, Spinoza was a early materialist philosopher. He didn't believe in purely abstract metaphysical speculation. He very much believed in scientific work. And he believed when you engage in science, you're learning about God. That's what he thought. Because he believed that God was, when you're trying to understand how bodies work, for example, you're doing physics, you're studying nature, you're getting, essentially, you're starting to understand the attributes of God. That's his idea. You're understanding the attribute of extension and how it works and what it makes possible. When you're studying psychology, Spinoza thought you're engaged, this is a kind of understanding God's creation. This was his idea, and to many this was radical. The 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Engels said that Spinoza negated theology from within theology. So instead of standing outside of theology and criticizing it, like many modern atheists like Richard Dawkins would do, Spinoza embraced the aspects of theology, but in order to break down many of their assumptions, while retaining, I would argue, retaining in many ways a very deeply religious outlook. I don't think Spinoza was an atheist. I think he very much believed in God, but how he believed in it was different from how the traditional religions believed in it. So that's Spinoza's idea, and we'll see how his ideas influenced other philosophers in the future. That's all I'm going to say about this today. I hope this video was helpful.